right, thank you everyone and welcome. We are so pleased that you all are here to join us for today's webinar. I am Dr. Elise Wilkerson. I am the Associate Director of the Center for Policy Research and Evaluation at PRE. And PRE is within NYU Metro Center. So just a little context, NYU Metro Center is an umbrella organization that houses a range of technical assistance and organizing centers with the goal of supporting communities and schools to create equitable systems and structures for those most impacted by inequity. PRE is the research hub of Metro Center, and our mission is to help nonprofit organizations, schools, and districts to improve the well-being of academic experiences of students most impacted by inequity. So I'm going to start our slideshow presentation.
Hey, Elise, before you jump in, is there a way that you can turn the chat on so we can communicate with our attendees?
Yes, so I am going to just make sure I share screen. I see that the chat is disabled. We'll make sure we get the chat set up for you all. Some folks are joining from Sadie Nash. Chat has been disabled. Yeah, all of those things. All right. So I'm going to share screen. All right, welcome everyone. So that was a bit about me and who our organization is at Metro Center. As I mentioned before, we do our goal is at PRE is to ensure that BIPOC students most impacted by inequity are having the best experiences that they can. We do our research in solidarity with youth and parents and educators and communities that have been historically marginalized. We do our work collaboratively with researchers and practitioners from universities, as well as community-based organizations. We have an equity lens and we strive to do our work from a culturally responsive and sustaining perspective. And so we are joined here today with an illustrious panel of experts who have been doing culturally responsive and sustaining out of school time programs for a very long time. We're also joined here today with my colleagues from PRE, Wendy Perez, Lindsay Foster, and Sarah McAllister, who were integral members in helping to run the research studies to analyze the data associated with the findings that we present today. And they were integral in uplifting the 5 practices that we will present today. In terms of the panelists, we have Giselle Castro, who is the Executive Director of Exalt. We have Amalia Orman, who is the Youth Voice Manager of NYC GOE. We also have Tanae Howard, Executive Director of the Sadie Nash Leadership Project, and Chanel Gabriel, who is the Executive Director of Urban Word. So the way today is going to work is that first we're going to ground ourselves in culturally responsive and sustaining practice, thinking through, what are those practices and why is it important for out of school time programs? And then we'll present the findings from the studies, which are the 5 practices, and then we'll go into our panel presentation. And just a logistical thing so far. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, please feel free to lift up those questions in the chat box. We're working on getting that chat box in the question and answer session or question and answer feature all ready for you all and to drop any questions that you may have. So now what I'll do is turn it over to Dr. Wendy Perez to ground us in CRSC principles and talk a little bit about the research studies from which our findings are uplifted today. Take it away, Wendy.
Thank you. So I wanted to start us off by going through our guiding question for today, which is how can youth workers create out of school time programs that are culturally responsive and sustaining and that foster positive developmental outcomes? And we're going to go ahead and ground ourselves in the landscape of CRSE and the literature of CRSE and out of school time programs. So when we look at the culturally responsive and sustaining education literature, we see that youth and family voices are essential for forming the educational experience, that educators possess a deep understanding of their culture and the cultural ways of knowing of their students, that critical consciousness is a key feature of pedagogy that helps students to connect historical and contemporary events as a way to engender engagement and skill building that fosters learning, that culture is not static, that it's fluid and pedagogical approaches should be fluid as well, and also that young people create and push culture, and that youth culture should be leveraged as an asset for learning. So when we move to CRSE programs and out of school time programs, which will be the next slide, if we can move over the next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, so for out of school time programs, these provide youth opportunities to develop leadership skills and engage in social action, co-design programming, cultivate critical consciousness and social emotional skills, and connect with and affirm their intersectional identities. So one thing to think about is that like schools, OSC programs have the potential to embody assimilationist and deficit frameworks that seek to rinse young people of their cultures. So implementing a new program or redesigning an existing program that embodies CRC features requires intentionality and a lot of planning. And while most youth-serving adults have the desire to support the well-being of young people, they may struggle to design these types of CREC programs, and they might tokenize their students by reducing their culture to superficial celebrations like for food and holidays that really don't hold a lot of meaning. And youth-serving adults also may not know where to start or where some of the practices could be. And while there is a small body of literature on CRC practices and out-of-school time programs, there are organizations across the nation that have been enacting these practices in youth programs. And so we'll go to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So today we're going to be talking about three studies that we've been conducting over the last 4 years that focus on critical consciousness, developmental competencies, and CRSE. So in 2017, we launched the YO and BSAC studies. The Youth Organizing Trajectory Study is a 3-year longitudinal study that examined how youth organizing spaces fostered critical consciousness and developmental competencies. The Borough Student Advisory Council, the BSAC study, was a 3-year longitudinal study that examined how youth leadership councils fostered critical consciousness and developmental competencies. We also did a third study, the Racial Identity Study, which examined how a cohort of 5 organizations enacted cultural solutions to educational problems and how those practices support developmental outcomes such as racial identity, development, and social emotional well-being. We examined the 5 organizations' design features, their practices, activities, philosophies, and theories of change that promote CRC, racial identity, and other indicators of positive development. So when we look at the YO study, it had 103 participants with 3 points of data over time, over 100 with 2 time points of data, and 76 with qualitative data. When we look at our BSAC study, it had 176 participants with 2 time points of data and over 300 with 1 time point of data. When we're looking at both of these studies, the YO and the BSAC study, we conducted site visits, interviews with students and staff, pre and post surveys were administered as well to determine the impact of the programs on their developmental competencies, such as social skills, contribution, self-management, and positive identity. We also looked at critical consciousness, like critical reflection, motivation, and action. So it's important to consider that while these studies had very similar methodological approaches, again, the YO and the BSAC study, the contexts were very different. So the YO study focused on community-based organizations that were doing youth organizing. Meanwhile, the BSAC study was New York City Department of Education sponsored youth leadership councils. So the BSACs were firmly rooted in the schooling structure and the YO programs were not. And when we look to our third study, which is the racial identity study, we focus on understanding the context of each organization by bringing organizational leaders together to discuss their theories of change, their programmatic models, and their problems of practice. While youth were not participants of the study, we did convene a youth advisory board that informed our research instruments, our tools, and our findings. And this study was launched a bit later in 2021. So organizations that participated in the 3 studies were district-wide youth leadership councils and nonprofits based across the nation that focused on leadership development, youth-led organizing issues, arts, history, gender justice, and criminal justice, And all the participants were high school aged youth. So that was just a bit about the 3 studies we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to my colleague, Sarah.
Thanks, Wendy. Elise, are you able to make me host again so I can turn my video back on?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Great. Thanks. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So as Wendy mentioned, these 3 studies were looking at very different contexts, but we were able to identify a set of consistent practices that we saw across each of the studies. So we found that it's important to select staff that reflect the identities and values of students, to intentionally create and maintain welcoming and safe environments, to create abundant opportunities for youth to lead, use art and storytelling for healing and meaning making, and to intentionally cultivate critical consciousness, both among staff and among young people. I'm going to move through these findings pretty quickly so that we have lots of time for the panel conversation. So first, across the 3 studies, we found that staff selection was important for creating OST programs where students feel heard and where their identities, experiences, and perspectives were affirmed. Within the BSEC study, because it's a different context, this houses in the Department of Education, staff were not intentionally selected for their identities, but all of the adults who were leading BSECs were very passionate about youth development and leadership and making sure that students were affirmed. In the YO groups and the community practice organizations in the racial identity study, program leadership intentionally selected staff that aligned with students' communities or lived experiences. I'll just share a couple of brief quotes. An adult facilitator in the BSEC study reflected, I think, to be an ally, first, it starts with just being dedicated to it and really making the time for it, which is hard to do in this position since we have a wide array of responsibilities from safety to youth development. So I think carving out time for it and prioritizing it is important and hard to do. And a staff member from a racial identity community of practice organization shared, our mission really is to support young women and gender expansive youth. So when it comes to hiring, the staff should have similar identities to that of the young people they work with because of the importance of lived experience. So just a few recommendations related to this finding. Consider selecting staff who come from the same communities as the students that your organization serve and reflect the values of the youth they serve. We know from research that racial matching and other forms of matching on identity between staff and young people are really important for building responsive and affirming environments. But it's also crucial that staff have the intention and the skill to affirm young people's identities, value their perspectives and voices, and facilitate young people's leadership in OST spaces. You can go ahead to the next slide. So our second finding was that these organizations were very intentional in creating welcoming spaces that fostered belonging, and they did this in a range of ways. So this was something that all the organizations invested quite a lot of time and effort into, creating spaces where young people could bring their full selves and be seen and affirmed. This was most challenging for the BSEC facilitators who only met with young people once a month. So BSEC facilitators built in plenty of time for icebreakers, fun team building exercises, and lots of small group conversations to get young people talking across schools, not just with young people from their own schools. Similarly, the youth organizing groups in our study relied on community norms of respectful listening, inclusion, and active participation, and working towards consensus. And young people themselves took responsibility for welcoming and acculturating new members. Staff in the Gates racial identity community of practice organizations strove to create spaces that embraced young people's multiple identities by gently challenging oppressive or exclusionary language when it came up. They were flexible and responsive in their facilitation, always prepared to slow down or change tracks in response to the immediate needs of young people in the room or in the Zoom, as it were, for much of the study. We can go ahead to the next slide. So I'll just share a couple quick quotes. It does become a conversation around, what does equity look like? What does the safe space look like? What does it look like for everyone to feel welcomed in the space, to be invited in and not feel like an outsider, from a racial identity study participant? And then a young person from one of the youth organizing groups in our city shared, So many meetings we always have new members. It may be you yourself might be the new member, or you might meet another member. You might feel so out of place, but then eventually it ends up becoming a home. Like we end up loving each other despite the different beliefs we may have and the debates we may have. Next slide. So just a few recommendations that, this kind of work takes a lot of time and intentionality. So adults need to be really proactive in creating and then maintaining over time those safe, brave, and inclusive spaces. And that is facilitated through norms and routines that focus on relationship building, mutual accountability, and inclusivity. And always, but particularly the last few years, really being attentive and responsive to young people's needs. The next slide. Our third finding across the 3 studies was just centering the importance of creating opportunities for young people to lead. So BSEC members who represented their schools in teams of 2 or 3, or sometimes more, saw themselves as representatives of a larger constituency of students, right? So they were representing not only their own interests, but the interests of all of the students in their schools. In the BSEC space, they really strove to articulate the issues that they were seeing in their schools, discuss potential solutions, and communicate their ideas and concerns upwards towards decision makers within the Department of Education. In the youth organizing groups, as the people closest to issues in schools, young people collectively decide on what they want to work on, what issues they want to address, and use consensus building to design campaigns and plan actions. So young people, including even members who are pretty new to organizing, take part in key roles in planning, leading, and debriefing actions. And in several of the racial identity community of practice organizations, participants and alumni occupied decision-making roles on boards of directors or alumni boards, as well as offering feedback and advice through less formal channels. So we just want to lift up the importance of creating space for lots of opportunities for young people to identify, discuss, debate, and research issues that are relevant to their lives, and ensure that young people have ownership over the work and real opportunities for offering feedback, making decisions, and building their power individually and collectively to address the issues that are affecting them. Critical consciousness means having the skills to understand societal inequalities, trace their root causes, and then take action individually or collectively to address them. Critical consciousness is a really key dimension in most culturally responsive and sustaining education theories, but it often gets overlooked in practice. It's sort of the last step that we often don't get to. And we think that out of school time organizations are really key spaces for fostering critical consciousness, because staff are often positioned to help young people challenge systems and institutions in ways that public school staff just can't be. The racial identity community of practice organizations fostered critical consciousness through their core organizational activities. So analyzing historical events, analyzing poems and songs that critique and subvert stereotypes, providing explicit preparation for young people to confront and navigate racism that they experience and other forms of bias in school, internships, and work. In youth organizing, critical consciousness is sort of central to the goal and mission of the organizations. And we saw evidence that the groups in our study supported young people's critical analysis skills through structured political education workshops, conversations about issues impacting their own lives, research on campaign issues, and then carrying out campaigns. This work really depends on adults who have built their own critical analysis skills, are excellent facilitators, and are willing to continually challenge their own thinking. Critical consciousness was less centered in the BSECs. Facilitators had a little bit less support for developing their own critical skills and just less space to challenge systems being situated within the Department of Education. While BSEC members expressed some desire for more structured conversations to unpack issues in their schools, they found a lot of value in the cross-school discussions that happened, where they could contextualize their own experiences of inequity and really connect them to larger systems. I'll share one quick quote. This is from a young person in a youth organizing group who said, in school, if there's a debate or something political that you want to say, the teachers say, you're acting out, or you're doing too much, or you have too much strong feelings about this topic. In my organizing group, people challenge you with love. We need to be challenged with love. I need to have conversations about stuff that I don't understand and it not be a problem. So really contrasting their experiences in school with the way their organizing group welcomes and embraces conversation around political topics. So fostering critical consciousness really takes skill and intentionality. So we would recommend providing staff with professional development support in order that they can feel confident facilitating, difficult conversations around historical and contemporary issues. And then it's also just really important to build support for critical consciousness into daily practice and core activity. So this is something that's skills that young people are constantly practicing and refining. And then finally, our last finding is around using art as a tool for joy, catharsis, meaning making, and healing. So I'll just share a quote from Bettina Love. Art is more than a class or mode of expression. It's how dark children make sense of this unjust world and a way to sustain who they are as they recall and remember in the midst of chaos what it means to survive. So really seeing art as a crucial tool for critical consciousness development and for identity development. The nature of the youth organizing groups in BSECs was more focused on taking action on particular issues. But the racial identity study community of practice organizations, on the other hand, many of them had an explicit focus on arts and incorporated some vision of arts into their curriculum and programming regularly. Arts integrate academic skills like writing and critical thinking with critical consciousness, and they really allow students to make meaning of their experiences and witness the expression of others' meaning making. We'll just share a couple of voices. These are two snippets of an anchor poem that or the Urban Word used as sort of the anchor for reflection in a workshop. So a snippet of the Poets by Elizabeth Acevedo. And Kingmakers of Oakland alumni wrote and produced the Kings in the Making album as a soundtrack for the movement. So in the video of the song that we've excerpted here, I'm a King, we see joyful and powerful portraits of Black boys with fists raised and wearing crowns, overlaid with lyric and visual references to Black history. And the artist really offers an explicit critique of schools as institutions upholding white supremacy, and asserts Black intellectual history as a source of self-knowledge and political development. So a few recommendations. Obviously not every program or session needs to focus on oppression, but identity expression, but these are really crucial, and arts can be a way of infusing this work with joy and meaning. So we would recommend that if OST programs are not explicitly arts-based, that staff still consider incorporating activities that center self-expression and creativity. Doing this in a responsive way might involve free writing and reflecting on current events together, or anchoring a lesson plan in a song that captures students' responses to current events. And I will pass it back to Elise.
Elise, you're on mute.
Thank you, Chanel. Thank you, Sarah and Wendy, for lifting up those practices and grounding us in culturally responsive and sustaining principles. So now we'll transition to our panel discussion. As I mentioned before, we have a wonderful panel here, and I'm super excited to have this conversation with folks who've been doing this work for a while. I did brief introductions earlier, but if each one of the panelists can just do a quick introduction of themselves and what they do at their organizations, and we can start off with you, Giselle, and then you can just toss it to whoever else you see fit. So take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you so much for walking us through this research on cultural responsive and sustaining practices for young people who are young. I am the executive director of Exalt. We focus with young people who are high school bound or GED bound, but all of our young people are court involved, ages 15 through 19. We are located in Manhattan, and we serve the 5 boroughs. I'm going to pass it over to Chanel.
Definitely saw that coming. Hi, everyone. My name is Chanel Gabriel. I am the executive director of Urban Word, which is a youth organization that champions youth voice through poetry, the arts. That is free workshops around poetry and hip hop. and creative writing. That's college bound and college access programming, as well as through the National Youth Poet Laureate program, which we founded back in 2009. So we do a lot of really great work around this, and we're in over 100 schools every year, primarily Title I schools, in partnership with the DOEs, different divisions within there, as well as schools as needed. So glad to be able to be here, and I'm going to pass it over to Tanae.
Thank you, Chanel. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanae Howard. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Executive Director at Sadie Nash Leadership Project. So happy to be here with y'all and to be what feels like reunited with some of our colleagues from the racial identity study. So Sadie Nash's mission is really to empower and equip young women and gender expansive youth to be agents of change in their own lives and in the world. And we, hey Corinne, we do that work in the 5 boroughs of New York City and also in Newark, New Jersey. Yeah, I'm so thankful to be able to have learned and gained so much from this crew of folks over the last many moons. And I will pass it to Amalia.
Thank you. My name is Amalia Orman, she, her pronouns. And right now I have this very cool role in the DOE called the Student Voice Manager, which was created by young people so that they could have more decision-making power in our system. And so I feel very blessed to be invited by them to this role. I come from social justice youth development land. So I'm excited to be here with people who I've collaborated with and learned from and with in the past. And this research study was super helpful coming into work on a program that was pre-existing and to be able to improve those programs and create new programs for DOE that is really focused on youth adult partnership and youth power. Elise, do I hand it back to you or keep going?
I think everyone went. Chanel, you went. Yes, everyone has introduced themselves. So yes, thank you. So let's get this conversation rolling. So the first question for you all is, why is incorporating culturally responsive and sustaining practices in OST programs important for young people and their well-being? And that's to anyone. Feel free to jump in or take a moment to think.
I can jump in real quick to get us started. Something that Sarah mentioned brought up for me a really important point in terms of what's a really important kind of tool or strategy for youth serving adults as they're creating these types of programs. And one of that is to really think about how folks address the tension between process and product, and being really committed to being supportive of and attentive to and present with the process that young people are going through and leading us through. I think Sarah brought up the point about like, what does it mean to be attentive to young people's experiences and attentive to their needs? And it means that, for example, we may be doing a program that is action oriented and that we're working towards a goal, but really making sure that that goal or that kind of product that we're hoping to create or project that we're working on we don't keep going through it if young people are saying, hey, we need something else, or this is not being responsive. And I think that can be really difficult for facilitators in the moment to kind of think of, okay, well, we have this end in sight, like how do we kind of keep it going? But I think making sure that we know and understand and are valuing the process that we're going through, that the kind of staff are valuing the process, that their managers and that even funders are listening to the fact that the process that young people are experiencing is important as well, is I think something that is really important to do, right? And so that means maybe stopping and listening. That means that may mean redirecting kind of our energies. For us at Sadie Nash, kind of especially in the last couple of years, part of what that's meant is that we have been listening, more deeply to the mental health and well-being concerns of our young people, and being responsive in those ways, and creating pathways to to deepen the discussions in that space, before kind of moving through to the other things that were kind of original goals or intention of our program. So I think that piece, really being as committed to the process and getting as many tools as necessary and support necessary to be able to redirect and listen to where young people, what they're saying is really important.
Thank you, Tanae.
I'd like to add, and just speaking about process, thank you for bringing that into this space. I think the importance of culturally responsive work, it allows us to bring the whole young person and their life and their experiences to the forefront, and it becomes the pathway to learning. We know we all learn differently. We know we all experience the world differently, and those things all matter, and they all mix together whenever you put them into any context, whether it's a classroom, whether it's an after-school program, and just and leaving out like the cultural context of our young people is literally like trying to speak German and expecting them to be able to get math, right? If you're not, I understand numbers, right? But if the language part is not there, it's definitely going to hinder my process and progress, right? So I really think the idea of considering the cultural context that we're teaching in, the narratives that our students bring into spaces, it is so integral into really, really being able to help young people connect to work, to material, to their future, to their identity, in all of these ways that allow them to show up as full, whole human beings later.
Thanks, Chanel.
Not later, presently as well, sorry.
I can respond just quickly. I think that I run leadership programs for the Department of Ed now. And I think I've noticed that young people really, for a lot of reasons, believe that they have to check a lot of who they are at the door to do a leadership thing or be in school, succeed. And I think it's really important to create healing spaces that basically help us decolonize in that way. And that's good for me. That's good for my students. And sometimes I think young people will bring a little something that maybe they usually silence in educational spaces. And if you catch it and you make sure that, no, that's welcome, and who else connects with that, I think that can create a really welcoming space that feels different. And sometimes young people have to ease into it, but there have to be a lot of clues, right? Like that you're welcome here, or it has to be very obvious that you're welcome here. But I think that can be really healing to feel that way in an educational space, because often our educational spaces, they don't always feel like that.
Yeah.
I'll add, which is a great question. Using the EXALT model, which works with young people who are in high school, we have created a culturally relevant, responsive, and sustainable curriculum. And these are young people that they're coming in from the 5 boroughs, and it's very important to always center anything that we do around our young people, like knowing that, following the adult development principle, they're not us like the adults. We moved out of high school a long time ago. And in order to ensure that our young people are healthy, that they're thinking, that they're thriving, it's critical that we take not just, their culture, but culture into, consideration. Typically in places that our young people learn, they can't see themselves. And if they can't see themselves, they cannot envision a different future. And if they can't envision a different future, they cannot participate. And, at EXALT, we always make sure that the voices of our young people are heard. It's embedded in the curriculum. It's embedded in the structure of the organization when we're thinking about strategic planning, when we're envisioning anything that impacts them. And I would say that even that is culturally responsive, because we're taking their ideas as young leaders into consideration.
Mhm.
Also, I'll close out with this, we're aiming to make massive, impact, and that is young people who have serious felony charges and they're in high school to have judges vacate their sentencing. And we know that in many of our young people's culture, they are being prepared for what they may, consider either, prison or, as they will sometimes express, or death. To have an organization that's culturally responsive, it becomes to me like a moral obligation, very critical, because if we are the holders of a short period of time of our young people's trajectory, we have to ensure that their voices are embedded and that we know how they respond to the world. It's us who translate it, but I will stop there because God knows I could say so much about Exol, our model, our strategy, and the impact, but that's just a great question.
Yeah. Thank you all for that. It sounds like, there's a lot to consider when thinking about enacting culturally responsive and sustaining practices from a structural level. So building it into the organization, whether that is through having advisory boards for what that young people are a part of, hearing their voices, building it into the curriculum. And also when you're enacting that curriculum and you're interfacing with the young people, that you're being responsive to what they need in the moment. And it sounds like you need to be nimble in particular in those moments and aware yourself. So there's a lot to sort of dig into, but one question that I do have in sort of thinking about folks who have the desire, right, to enact culturally responsive and sustaining programs or to shift their organization to one that embodies more CRSE practices. What do you all think is or suggest as a manageable first step for including culturally responsive practices or building that posture within an organization or youth program?
I firmly believe that a big part of getting folks to see the benefits of CRSE and the practices therein is seeing the validity of it. I think a lot of traditional educational settings have taught us that thinking about culture is this touchy-feely stuff. It's not concrete. It's not something that's grounding, like being able to say, I'm going to really think about, I'm gonna bring all these emotions and feelings into a room when I have to teach this thing or I have to get this goal done. And I think the idea of being able to, I think it's important to ground the organization and to speak to Urban Word, we hire from within a lot of times. The young people become alumni and we train them and pipeline them into being teaching artists, and they get to witness firsthand. I think, and they are the testimony of the work that, that we do, that organizations like us do in the community. It's really important to let them see that these practices really celebrate our students' strengths, in elevating their culture, elevating themselves. You're celebrating their strengths and allowing them to see their experiences and their lives as strengths, as opposed to deficits, which is what a lot of other spaces tend to do. So for us organizationally, I know for Urban Word, we really try to make a point of having adults actually have conversations, or they're even hired, they're actually asked to speak to young people. We've always had methods where different people coming in just kind of have at least that cultural litmus test, that cultural conversation that happens where it's like, these are the young people we serve. How comfortable are you actually having some real conversations with young people about what they think is what they know they need? And how do we trust them? How much do you trust the young people? I think that those are the things, at least getting those, pulling away at those threads, and also having them think about their own lives and who are the people that really served them as they were growing up, and realize that a lot of those practices, we have new terms for things, but there's a lot of cultural practices around this work, whereby, like, I think about my aunties and the church and the people I connected to, they treated me like I was an adult. They really actually wanted to know how I was doing. And I'm like, those are all embedded in these practices. And we've now founded them and actually been able to make principles out of them. And so just, I think the idea is really just being able to get adults to really understand what CRSE is, like what is it, and how does emotions in class actually help you with the work. Sometimes I think it's just sometimes it's just a foreign idea, because that is literally the antithesis of what some of these learning spaces that we've come from value and validate. So I think that that's the grounding thing first for me.
I love that.
Yeah, I think on that note, as you were speaking, Chanel, I was thinking a lot about the importance of creating space for reflection, and not just saying, to practitioners, to youth workers, it's important to reflect, but I think as an organization, creating space for that reflection to happen and like really like operationalizing it, right? And making sure that we are not kind of resting on what we think is happening or what we think should be, but we're constantly, like young people are constantly innovating and are, bringing different tools and methods, and it's important for us to kind of create that space where we can actually say, okay, this is how this went. This was the response. I like that response. What was happening in that moment? What did I do in that moment as a facilitator or a youth worker? That's what I think enables the nimbleness that you spoke to, Elise. And to be perfectly honest, I know it's a tension, even in an organization like Sadie Nash, we're committed to the reflection, and we often are like struggling amidst all the other things to make sure that it happens. But it's in that reflection that the praxis happens, right? That reflection can lead to different actions, and those actions will be able to reflect what young people are asking of us. And so I think for any organization that's really trying to shift to really incorporate, more CRSE, kind of approaches and methodologies, there has to be space for reflection in the day, in someone's working, in the time that they are working, not afterwards. It shouldn't be extra work that happens maybe on the weekend when, they're already doing all the extra. But asking that real question, like where in our practice, in our model, are we reflecting on what's happened, really taking that learning and then applying it as we're moving forward, because we shouldn't be stuck in our kind of spaces of how we did things. I think the last 2 years especially has taught us that there are different strategies, and there are really important ways in which things have shifted that we need to be responsive to. And like I shared, it's not easy, and I'm not gonna say it is and that we've got it all figured out, but I think we are really committed to not just finding that space, but creating it in partnership with young people as well. So.
I'll add very briefly, following what Tanae was saying, like in terms of practice. So at Exalt, we were founded in 2006, and we were focusing on a curriculum that is culturally relevant and sustainable, which is a big lift, for an organization. I would say for anyone considering it, it's important that they understand like what's the impact. What other organizations have been doing the work. I think that people respond to outcomes and impact. I would also, highlight, that this organization, year over year has been very diligent, very disciplined with its model, with its structure, to really learn it, to really understand it. And I would say, just to take, one aspect, whatever your organization is mandated to do, for us is sentence reduction, education progression, career exploratory, whatever it is that your organization is aiming to focus on, just take one aspect of it and then pilot something out. Because there is this mystery, like what is cultural relevant, what is cultural sustainability. it's beneficial, to all of us. Like, it's so important, it's so critical. I think that is not just our future, but if we're looking to move people into, thriving, environments, it has to be culturally responsive. But every organization is unique. Every organization is distinct. So I would, highlight first step is take one aspect and pilot, study, evaluate, and speak to other organizations that are currently doing this work.
I think that my title is student voice manager. I've never used the word student voice in my career until I had a job with that in the title. And I think it's helpful to name something like student voice in the same way that it's helpful to name something like CRSE, because then if it's a missing ingredient, like what's missing in the dish, but it's dangerous too because it can kind of like codify something that's very expansive and very deep and very nuanced. So I think having explicit goals and one of the things with the program that I stepped into was that the goals were fuzzy, and like there was not a theory of change that people were really dedicated to, and that was missing. And I think putting cultural responsiveness into your goals and putting critical consciousness development and collective action into your goals, that's very important to say, because then, like for the adults, you'll see like who feels like they're aligned with that already and who's like, I don't know what that is, and how do we align on that together. And I think there's a lot of resources within the world of education and youth development that talk about these things. And I think some people have taken the strategy of making CRSE more acceptable to people who might not be accepting of it by framing it in how it can help academic achievement. And it's really interesting when I put those kinds of materials in like a New York State framework for CRSE. I put that in front of young people and they're very turned off by the academic framing of it and how it's going to support their achievement. And they just really want to hear how it's important to them as whole people, to be thriving as whole people. So I think sometimes an adult-led initiative, bringing young people in, might be very refreshing for them to be included in some major decision-making. It also might resonate with something that's missing for them. There might need to be some education there too, but having young people translate into their own words what this would mean can also just be very powerful. I think you have to change other aspects of probably, like I would have to change other aspects of our system to have CRSE resonate. Like, is there collective decision making too? Are we in the habit of listening to young people? Because you can't really do CRSE without those other things too.
And that's really important to lift up all of these different recommendations, because each one of you are sort of positioned differently to education, right? So Sadie Nash and Exalt and Urban Word are, I would say, very education adjacent in some sense. And Amalia, your work you're very much so embedded within the NYC DOE. So your considerations around how do you get people on board and what resonates with young people and why, and when something is rolled out, what it looks like from students, it may look like another school initiative, right? So all these different considerations based on how, a leader is situated within their context is going to impact the strategies that they take. But it sounds like goal setting, picking a curriculum in an aspect of your program to pretty much pilot, to test out the curriculum, to pilot it, to evaluate it, to get feedback from young people is all super important. And celebrating the strengths of young people, building that trust is what I've heard, leaning into young people's culture and what they're bringing. So that reflection piece, just sitting and listening and being with young people and knowing what they want are all sort of practical things that folks can take first steps to begin to bring in this more culturally responsive and sustaining posture within their program. I'm mindful of the time, but I do want to pose one more question for you all, and maybe not everyone will be able to get to it, but within this climate today, part of creating culturally responsive and sustaining programs within organizations, particularly ones that have been established and you're sort of changing the tide from something that might be a little bit more status quo, or that might be social justice, but you want to take it to the next level. Do you have any recommendations for how an organizational leader can sort of overcome staff resistance, right? So if you're dealing with folks who may not completely be on board, but they've been there for a while, and you have a vision, you're getting ready to lay out this new vision. We believe that CRSE is a good approach for young people, but how do you get past that resistance, or how do you how do you get past it, or engage that person and bring people on board to CRSE practices?
I love that question so much. I love it so much because it's a challenge, to call it grow an organization or to change an established organization to take on, call it a new philosophy. And what a leader should always do, and it could always be done like under a guise, I call it under a strategic plan, but that's a process, that could take like almost a year to really educate, people on, what is going to be the impact. I think that organization naturally are always evolving and, explaining like what is the logic behind this evolution. And then, literally like step, articulating, goals like step by step by step. It is inevitable that people do walk into organization and they probably don't understand that every organization has its own culture. So when you're onboarding someone, it's an important time, to really, properly onboard, what direction you're going to take. I'll close out with this one. So the organization, as we onboard individuals, they have to do some reading, which is our reading. So we follow Paulo Freire's, Pedagogically Oppressed. They have to read that. Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, Just Mercy, Documentary 13th, and also read our curriculum. And then there's this process of engagement. For those individuals who are in the organization still questioning, that becomes the learning. I think that, when we get to see the impact that our young people are making, this is like when people, it's not that it's a buy-in, but they get to understand like what is the impact. To any leader, I would say, like, just understand it's a step-by-step methodical process. And it's not going to happen overnight, but it does happen. The biggest, process of making any type of substantial changes, it is with the people and the individuals that you have, moving the organization forward. But once people get to see like how phenomenal this really is and fun, I think that people then start to bring in like their interpretation, and they're like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe that this is, happening in the organization. So either for a startup organization, I would say it was the same principle. For us, an organization that is solid and is going to evolve, I would recommend the same process. And these are great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I see we have an answer in the chat, and I'll quickly read it. Tanae says, to answer the question of how you get people on board, I like what Amalia said about naming it. If folks don't know what it means, the first step is learning more. And then they can also decide whether this is something they want to get behind. But you have to name that this is your goal. I love that. I wish we had more time together. We have about 3 minutes late. Oh, I see Chanel. Okay, I'm going to read it quickly.
Oh, no, that was in response to the other, there was a question in the chat that talked about the idea of loving accountability and just recognizing that I think sometimes we pull challenge out of it. We're like, I want to love them, so I'm not going to challenge them. So just bringing that, because Tanae made a really great comment about how to do it, but also recognizing the energy behind it as well, being the thing I want to challenge you, and it being centered there. But I concur with everything Giselle said as far as this question.
Wonderful. Thank you. I see the chat is, you all are having that conversation in the chat. And, I just want to thank the panelists. Thank you all today for just coming and uplifting and sharing your wisdom with us. I totally wish we had more time and we could talk about this for hours at a time. This is such an important topic, particularly how we can leverage these practices within spaces like out of school time programs for the well-being of young people. So thank you so much for joining us today. What I will invite everyone who joined us today in the audience is to complete a feedback form. Lindsay, if you can drop it in the chat, and what that'll do is give us more insight on what types of topics and programming and webinars will be helpful for you all to learn from. So thank you for joining us today. I also would like to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William T. Grant Foundation, and the Institute for Education Services for making the research possible. If you would like to get in touch with me, I can be reached at emh443@nyu.edu. We can share this webinar video with you, as well as the research brief that encompasses all of the findings from today's presentation. Thank you so much, and be well, everyone. Take care.
Thank
And
you.
Lisa, really quickly before we leave, the form says that folks need permission to fill it out. So if we could change that on there so that folks can actually give us their feedback.
Okay, I'll make sure that is changed. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Sure, bye.